Are you going?
Yep.
Okay. Our lecture today, our substitute for our classes we're missing, is on immortality. And we're covering 2 days worth of material today. Hopefully we can get this done in a hurry. It'll be not 3 hours worth of lectures, but we'll get as much done as we can. Your readings are, the readings we're covering are the reading from Plato and the readings from John Hicks. So I want you, even though we're not in class, to have your textbook handy, because occasionally I'm going to have to talk about particular passages from these two texts. But before we do that, let's take a step back for a minute and think about this in a context of our class. We haven't talked about it very much at all. 90% plus of your normal philosophy of religion class, sometimes 100% of a philosophy of religion class is on God and not on humanity and their afterlife. But it's obviously an essential part of religion, an essential part of a class on the philosophy of religion to deal with this question. A few things to say about it up front. It's too simple, probably, to, not probably, it's definitely too simple to ask whether we want this, because it comes in many, many, many forms. It's much more varied even than accounts of the notion of God. Accounts of the afterlife are multifarious and complicated, and some of them seem to make no sense in personal identity terms, say, which is probably the basic question we're going to be dealing with today. Some of them make a lot more sense than others, but they also diverge in terms of whether we would want them. Quick disambiguation. This and this, these two terms are obviously not synonymous. Immortality, usually at least, means that you're incapable of dying. An immortal thing is the kind of thing that has to survive. It's the kind of thing that cannot die. Immortal means death, right? Some accounts of the afterlife involve death, in fact require death. Resurrection, for instance, can only happen if the resurrected being dies and then is raised from the dead. So a resurrected being is not immortal, and an immortal being is not resurrected. So the afterlife can mean many things. A person may, the ancient Greeks, before Plato at least, thought that you did survive your death in a really weak, empty way. They thought that the breath in your chest when you died would be released, like the breath of life, the same breath of life that the Hebrews believed animated you. The Greeks thought animated you, and when you died, it would get expelled into the atmosphere like a ghost and hover around you for a few minutes until it was blown away by the wind. Now, is that an account of an afterlife? Kind of. But it is certainly not an immortal afterlife. You could have accounts of the afterlife where you have more life that then dies. But this and this don't necessarily mean the same thing. That's one thing to start off with. Immortality, if we take it seriously, until that eternal life. Now, we've already hit questions about eternity and God. Well, we hit them recently before I think that was in the last class before the hurricane. We talked about this word with respect to God. There's more than one account of what it means to be eternal. There is the everlasting, so-called eternal eternity, where an eternal life would mean a life that moves through time like ours does, moves forward from one day to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, but it's not in any way outside time.
What is that word that eternal means?
Sempiternal is the old Latin term for an everlasting. And it's one account for both God and for man of what an eternal life might be. It's a life whose relationship to time is just like yours and mine. It moves through time from one day to the next in your ordinary, everyday conception of beginning, middle, end, except it has an end. So it's a temporal process. When we talked about God and God's eternity, by far the more common view on God is that God is an atemporal being, a being who is outside time, who governs it, who created time and space just like he created the world and governs it, and is not a spatio-temporal being moving through time, but is a timeless thing, like a geometric form or an eternal truth, where it's not right exactly to say that some truth is true one day and then moves to the next day like a person does. Has a different relationship to time. He stands outside it. When we talk about eternal life, there are big questions about what we mean. Do we mean a kind of thing that moves through time, or a kind of thing that is somehow above it and eternal in the same way that God might be? It's hard to think of a human being this way. The normal model for an atemporal being is the form of the triangle. The form of the triangle is not the kind of thing that changes. It's not the kind of thing that could change. It's not the kind of thing that can be created or destroyed. And so its eternity is kind of self-explanatory, because it's not the kind of thing that exists in time and gets created and destroyed. So calling it eternal makes sense, because that's the kind of thing that it is. To talk about a human being this way, it's not clear that an atemporal being can think or feel or learn, because learning is a temporal process. You don't know something and then you come to know it and you have an epiphany and then you move on to the next stage. It's a temporal process. So an eternal life for a human is probably going to be that, an everlasting life. Now there are obvious questions here about whether that's the kind of thing a human being would want, or at the very least would want unconditionally. Life can drag on too long, some people say now, and if someone promised you that you would live forever if you take the what's in box A, you might have some questions you want to ask first about whether you want them, right? An eternal hell? No. An eternal what then? An eternal heaven? The word is easy, but filling it in with something that would make you want to live like a human life, at least in this way, forever, can be hard to do. There's a famous paper by Bernard Williams on this called the Macropolis case. It's a reflection on an opera he saw called the Macropolis case, in which he argues that rationally, if you were offered eternal life, you should turn it down. The moral of the opera, this girl, Elena Macropolis in the opera, is given an elixir for eternal life by her father, who is an alchemist. And he's found the philosopher's stone that will give you immortality. It's immortality of a kind if you keep taking it every 100 years. And she takes it for 100 years and survives 100 years. And then she takes another one and survives another 100 years. All her friends die. Everyone she knows dies. Everything she cares about starts to become monotonous and boring. There's a line in the opera where she says, in the end, it is all the same singing in silence. And after 300 years of this, she throws away the elixir amongst a clamoring of old men who want to save it. And dies. And dies because she is bored. Not because she's suffering in any traditional way, in a sense, not in any obvious sense of the term, but because she can't figure out how to make herself want to be alive for another 100 years, what would make her happy more. She's had this question, I think, may drive people to be religious more than any need for explanation from God. It's just the bare need to survive makes people want there to be a God who can save them. But these are some questions we want to know going in. What would you get? What would God promise you? What would He offer you? It's not what I was thinking about when I was talking about Dante earlier to the camera woman there.
Hey guys.
But if you read through the Divine Comedy, this is relevant about Dante too. If you read through the Divine Comedy, the most interesting book in the Divine Comedy, by far, is his description of hell. It's intricate, it's varied, it's exciting in a really scary way. You have stories that all make sense about why people get punished the way they do, and it's frightening as all hell, and because literally it's hell. When he moves through it, it's purgatory. Purgatory is similar. When he gets to heaven, Paradiso, everybody stops reading. And they stop reading for a pretty obvious reason, because Dante himself, the human being, the man, had nothing to say about heaven. He could not find a way to make it interesting. He could find an infinite number of ways to make hell interesting, because it is interesting, it's frightening. We can imagine infinite things that would torture us. But to try to imagine things that would make us happy eternally, it shouldn't be hard, but it was hard. And he couldn't do it. The entire book consists of Dante watching angels sing and dance forever. Forever. You might like that. But they do a little twirl dance when they're in this circle, and they do a little spinning dance when they're in. It's weird. And it's...
But the idea is that maybe an art form would be what people would choose if they had to live forever.
It would be something that has to do with beauty. It would have to do something to do with something eternal like that, though. Something
that evolves.
Something like music and art are eternal. They point towards eternal things. And at the end, at the center of Paradiso, at the center of heaven, is the most eternal of eternal things, God. And if you are lucky enough, you get to be in the inner circle who gets to watch God forever, which he obviously thought would be the one thing that could keep you entertained for all of eternity. These questions aside, though, the harder philosophical questions are about what it means to survive your death. What, in fact, you surviving your death means as a metaphysical problem. And it's a personal identity question at heart. I'm going to erase some of this and start over. If you ask your average Christian what the afterlife is going to be, you'll get one of two different stories. And they're very different, but they'll often be treated interchangeably. They'll be treated as though they mean the same thing. They'll be treated as though maybe they go together. Story one. The afterlife means that the soul is separated from the body and goes to heaven to live with other immaterial souls. And we'll hit this in a minute, but soul, body, separated, you lose your body, which is not a problem because you never were your body, goes story one. Story two, you die, and you are resurrected from it. Now, are these two stories the same story? They're not the same story. They're both Christian stories in some sense of the word. They have very different origins and they mean very different things. And they get conflated. Again, Dante, and this is why I was talking about Dante before the camera got turned on. In Dante, you'll get weird stories like in the Inferno, in the Wood of Suicides, so-called. There's a story where there's a passage in the Inferno where he goes through the part of hell where everyone who commits suicide goes. And everyone who has committed suicide has been oddly turned into a tree in this dark forest. And they've got thorns and it's, ominous. And Dante's walking through it and he accidentally breaks off a branch. And the branch, he finds out, the tree talks to him. And he finds out that the tree is a person who committed suicide. And he gets the story of the man who committed suicide. They talk. And he asks what his fate is going to be. And the fate goes something like this. He is in hell and will stay in hell forever. Everyone in hell will someday, and that someday is Judgment Day, will on Judgment Day get their bodies back. Okay, so let's think about this. They are in hell. What does it mean to say that they are in hell? Maybe this. It's not a soul he talks to, though. It's a tree he talks to. But most of the other people, like the boatman on the river Styx, is dead. And when he's riding on his boat, the boat doesn't sink. When Dante steps into it, the boat sinks. So the people he's talking to are souls. And on Judgment Day, they'll get their bodies back. The suicides are the exception because since they gave their bodies away in life, they don't get their bodies back on Judgment Day. On Judgment Day, they have to drag their bodies back to the forest and hang them from the trees. It's awful and dark.
So the trees won't be judged as trees.
They'll be judged as the people who have been forced into this new form as their punishment, right? But part of this punishment is they'll never be reunited with their bodies. Everyone else will be. Everyone else will get their bodies back.
Even people who did evil things.
Yeah, even people who did evil things. And when they get their bodies back, maybe that means they'll suffer all the more. I don't know. But it's part of the conclusion of the divine plan that people's bodies and souls will be reunited. And when they're reunited, the judgment is complete. The afterlife has been completed, right? Until these two are rejoined, we're just waiting for a judgment day. Now, this is an odd thing because when you talk to someone in heaven, it appears you're talking to them, though there's no body involved. So, what do we think about why would you need your body back? Is it the same body that died? All of this rests on a really deep and important question about personal identity. All right. The story goes something like this. If you want to know what it means for you to survive your death or to be risen back to life after you die, then we need an account, a coherent account, and the right account of what you are in the first place, so that we know what it means for you to survive, right? Without an account of what makes you you, we couldn't in principle know whether you'd survived your death. So what makes you who you are it's a personal identity question. It's the basic question of personal identity, quite apart from any questions about the afterlife, but this is where that question seems to get vivid, where different answers to it actually start to matter. I want to look at Plato in a second, but can we pause for a second?
Go ahead.
Okay, so what it means for you to survive your death. The questions become bizarre when we talk about things like reincarnation, in which you hear stories told and such that you, the person I'm talking to, might become a raccoon or a god, or an insect, or you might have been an insect. And that's an odd thing to say. It's an odd thing to say that you, the person I'm talking to, might be an insect and nevertheless be Karen Trimble, or your name is. Right? Why is that weird? Why is that an odd thing to say? Because we know something about what makes you who you are, and it's not compatible with that kind of story. Right? Maybe you can make it compatible by telling some weird story about personal identity. But we gotta hammer this stuff out before we move on. Two old accounts of personal identity. They have names. The ego theory and the oddly named bundle theory. The ego theory, the name is self-explanatory, and ego is the Greek word for I. Right? The I theory is what the ego theory essentially says. And this is due to Rene Descartes, as so many things are. Descartes' account of himself in the Meditations, this comes up in context. He's asking himself whether there's anything he knows for sure. He asks himself whether his senses might be deceiving him. He thinks he sees a thing outside the window. Could he be wrong? I doubt my senses, he says. He thinks that his mathematical deduction on some problem was right, but I might be wrong, he says. I doubt my reason. Throughout this, you get a syntax. I doubt X. I feel Y. I think Z. What is Descartes? What is he? Is he this doubt, this feeling, this thought? No, he says. He is the I that has it. So, the ego theory tells you that behind your thoughts, behind your individual thoughts, your individual feelings, your individual beliefs, and everything in your middle life is something that has them all. Some substance, say. What kind of substance? Maybe a soul that thinks, that feels. I think, I feel. Now this thing, this I, he thinks he knows it better than he knows any of the things it does. I think that I see something outside the window. Well, the thing I see might be wrong. I doubt X, he says. So X might be wrong, but when he doubts that he exists, I doubt that I exist. He can't doubt that he exists. If I doubt that I exist, there must be an I doing the doubting, right? I think, therefore I exist. I doubt, therefore I exist. I is undoubted. It's a different sort of thing than any of his thoughts or feelings. Alright, so the basic story of the ego theory is that you are something behind your thoughts, something above them or underneath them. It's a substance is the old word for it, something under them, right, that has various qualities, as this thought has that. The other story. David Hume's story. Hume was an empiricist, a skeptic, but not any old sort of skeptic. He was an empiricist. And an empiricist, on principle, doubts anything that he cannot observe. And Hume asks in the first person, he asks it of himself. He says, I look inside myself, I introspect, and I try to find this I. The me that has the doubts, or me that has the feeling, the me that has the thought. Can I find that me? And when he looks inside himself, he says, all he can find is individual thoughts. I feel cold. I feel, smart today. Or I feel, etc. Or I think the sky is blue. And every one of those individual thoughts is a transient. I have this thought, gone. I have another thought, gone. I walk into a room, I feel cold, gone. And I feel fine, gone. Nothing in our individual, any one of our individual thoughts or feelings seems to be eternal. No one of them seems to go on forever. No one of them seems to be me. I'm not that thought, I'm not this thought, I'm not any of my individual thoughts. But the bigger question is, can I find something behind them? Can I see it? Can I feel it? Can I close my eyes and look inside myself and find an I that has survived my whole life? Hume's answer, he can't find it in himself. He says if you can, you're just different than him. But he says he certainly cannot find some ego that has survived his entire life, some soul behind the thoughts. All he finds is passing thoughts. These are two very different accounts of what makes you what you are. The Humean story is that you are individual thoughts and feelings, passing one at a time. You have this thought and it's gone. A new one comes along, it's gone. A new one comes along, it's gone. And then maybe you're gone. Right? But what are you? You are a bundle of thoughts and feelings without any I holding them together, because this is not something we can see. It's not something you can even see when you look inside yourself. So goes the argument. Now, why do we get into this stuff here? We're getting into this stuff right now because these two accounts of what you are, I am an ego that has an infinite number of thoughts, one thing that has many thoughts, or I'm just a bunch of parts that happen to be tied together. I have this thought and it disappears, and I have another thought and it disappears. Are two very different, are going to give two very different accounts of what it means for you to survive. Right? Now, back to souls and bodies. Pop quiz. Which one of these stories is the Christian story? Karen?
So I see soul goes to heaven and body resurrected.
Right.
For a regular person or for Jesus/Lazarus?
Either one.
I would say Christianity says your soul goes to heaven, but there are some instances in the Bible of bodies being resurrected.
Right. So goes the normal account. This is what people tend to believe, though they realize the Bible seems to say this. The answer is way messier than this. This, not Christian, at least not for the first 500 years or so of Christianity. This was Plato's story. It's the Platonic account of the afterlife. This was the Christian account, that bodies are resurrected from the dead. Well, what's the difference? What's the difference between the two? The Platonic account of the afterlife is that, okay, let's jump into the actual reading here. The background is that the history lesson to be had here is that Christians, until they came into contact with Plato and Platonists, had no conception of the soul. It had never occurred to them that they might be the ghost in the machine, to use Gilbert Ryle's old term for it. It was not a concept they had. It's not something they would have believed if they'd heard it. The Christian account of personal identity was that you are a thing created from ashes and dust, and to ashes and dust you will return. Right? It always had been that way. That was the Jewish story, and the early Christians were Jews. And they were Jews who wanted to come to terms with the idea that you, the flesh and blood being I'm talking to, not some ghost behind you, but you might survive your death. Where death means something real. Death means you are your body, and we know what happens to your body. Your body will break down and decompose, and that will be the end of you. Right? Christians believe that. They believe that when you die, you really die. Buried in the ground. And if that's what you think you are, if you think, and sort of the oddness of it is that the Christian view on this story is much more modern and scientific than the Platonist story. It has its account of what makes a human being what they are is physical, it's tangible, it's observable. You are not a ghost in the machine, you're a flesh and blood being I can talk to and touch and see. And if that's your account, if that's what you think you actually are, then we need an account of the afterlife that makes sense of that makes sense of this flesh and blood being surviving. Resurrection is supposed to guarantee that. It's supposed to be a story in which even if you are a body that dies, we can make that body, if you are your body, we can make you survive. Right? So how is this supposed to work? In contrast to the Platonist story, the Platonist story is, let's run through it quickly. Plato had a handful of arguments for the separation of the soul from the body and for the immortality of the soul. It went something like this. Most of these stories come from the theater, from Socrates' speech he gives before he dies and drinks his hemlock and commits suicide in prison, right? Forced suicide. As far as we know, all these words were put into his mouth by Plato. Socrates himself apparently was a skeptic about the afterlife, didn't think he knew what it was. That was his entire argument in the Apology, not to fear death, was that he didn't know what it was. But by the time Plato comes into his own in his later dialogues, he's using Socrates as a sock puppet. When you read through this dialogue and you see Socrates talking, just realize it's Plato talking. It's Plato who has come into his own, has studied with the Pythagoreans and has his own ideas about forms of knowledge and about the afterlife. A few arguments. One, probably the weakest of these arguments, what you call it the user argument. The user argument goes something like this. If one thing uses another, if A uses B, then A and B must be distinct things. If you use a hammer, you and your hammer must be distinct things. If you use your hand, you and your hand must be distinct things. If you use an arm, you and your arm must be distinct things. So the question was, do you use your body? Socrates asks, and his interlocutor says, well, yes, I use my body. So you and your body must be distinct things. Fine so far. Maybe as a metaphysical category, you and a thing you're using, you want to give different names to, but why think that one of these is like an immaterial thing and one of these is physical? I'm not a hammer either, but that doesn't mean hammers are immaterial, right? The deeper argument goes something like this, and it has to do with knowledge. And it's of a piece, if you've read any Plato, and we'll read the Euthyphro later in this class, and this will make more sense. Two kinds of knowledge. One, sensory knowledge. If you want to know whether there is, I don't know, a person in the room next door, what do you use to find out? You use your body to find out. You use your eyes or your ears or your hands to find out physical things. Now, part two, thought. how do we come to know eternal things, like the nature of justice or mathematical principles? How do you come to know the Pythagorean theorem? Do you come to know by looking at it or in some other way? In another way is the answer. You come to know eternal things not by looking for them, but by thinking. Now, here's where the argument here is supposed to be an argument from analogy. You know people, like I know Karen Trindle because I've seen her, but you know things about people, like their moral qualities, their goodness, their eternal qualities, by another faculty. You look at all the chairs in the room to see whether there are chairs in the room, to know what a chair is a totally different thing. It's not something you come to know by looking, it's something you come to know about by thinking. Now, we're capable, he thinks, of knowing eternal things. We're capable of knowing things like the nature of justice, the nature of God, the geometrical principles that will never change. And the argument for Plato, what seemed odd to him, was how a mortal thing could be capable of knowing something immortal. And his thought was that, in fact, a mortal thing couldn't. Nothing that wasn't itself eternal could know an eternal thing. If we know eternal things, must be like the things we know. If you're capable of knowing what justice is, if you're capable of knowing something timeless, then there must be something in you that is timeless, that is capable of eternity. What is that? The Greek word was psyche. And it means the same thing it means now. It means your mind. Plato was not the first or last Greek to believe in the psyche, but he was the first Greek to think that the psyche was eternal and only accidentally tied to this body. In the Phaedo, in Socrates' death scene, his friends are hysterical because he's about to die. And he, ironically, spends the dialogue consoling them. The consolation consists of him arguing that when they watch him die, in quotation marks, they're not going to watch him die at all, because he never was the body they were talking to. He was the psyche behind it. And that psyche never was a body, it just was accidentally related to a body. In fact, the body is a hindrance to thought, Plato thought. And if he were as devoted to thought and to eternal things as he had always pretended to be or wanted to be, then he should be happy to be freed from his body. Right? So goes the Platonist story. Now, if that story sounds at all Christian, that you are a thing accidentally related to your body, and when your body dies, your soul disappears, it's because it now is Christian. It wasn't at the beginning, but it got brought into and married to the resurrection story over the course of 400 or 500 years after the death of Jesus. Now, you look like you have a question.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
Isn't Psyche in Greek mythology, didn't she fall in love with Cupid as a human?
She did.
So what's the deal? Why does that mean eternal?
Well, I mean, it was also the Greek word for mind. And mind and love, if you are a Greek, make an awfully interesting couple. And hence there. But the goddess Psyche was not what Plato was talking about. He was not talking about the Greek goddess of the mind. He was talking about the mind in you. Now, can she be embodied? Well, in myths she can, but Plato is famously scornful of Greek mythology. And for this very reason, he thought that he banned the poets from his Utopia, from the Republic, and there's been an endless 400-year argument about what the hell that meant. Why would he ban the poets from his republic? He never, I mean, he was kidding. I mean, Plato was always saying things he didn't exactly mean just to make a point, but his point here was that Greek mythology made nonsense of the gods. It made them look like people. It made them fallible. It made them, you know, make mistakes and get jealous and chase each other around and cheat on their wives. And he thought all of that was absurd, and that proper knowledge of the gods and proper knowledge of justice would tell you something that was an awful lot different than the Greek religion, which, you know, if you've been in a philosophy of religion class for a little while now, you can kind of get a sense of it, where he was coming from. When you come to understand what these things really mean, they'll often look quite a bit off from your mythology, even Christian or Hebrew mythology too. Right? He had that dichotomy going on. That probably wasn't exact. I don't know if that answered your question.
It does.
But, okay. All right. The other story. Whether they can be put together or not, I want to put both of them out here just so we can see how different they are. The resurrection story goes something like this. If Plato was right, you are not your body. If the Bible, if we can talk monolithically about the Bible, every passage in the Bible that talks about the afterlife in any way, or about death in any way, treats you as a physical, spatio-temporal, you know, scientific, quote-unquote, being that will, you know, be born and died, and that was you. You are the flesh and blood person I'm talking to. And if you think that now, say in the 21st century, when it makes very little sense to people think to talk about your mind as something separate from your body, when we know about how many relationships, for instance, there are between your mind and your brain. If your brain disappears part by part, your mind will disappear part by part, and that doesn't seem like a coincidence. It seems like you really are a physical being. Then we might want an account of the afterlife that doesn't fly in the face of what we think we actually are. You know, if you really think you're a flesh and blood being, you probably want an account where you, the flesh and blood you I'm talking to, is still here at the end of the story. And that, of course, is what you get in the New Testament. You get a story of bodies dying and being resurrected from the dead. Now, what that means is tricky. The John Hick reading and the Plato reading, I think I've covered without even looking at the text. The arguments you get in the Phaedo about why is he talking about knowledge and justice and goodness, you might ask when you read through Plato. All of that was meant to be a metaphor for how the kinds of things we know and how we would have to be able to know those things. The argument there is that you must be like the things you know. John Hick wants to remind you that that story never was the Christian story anyway. Over time, it has been adopted by Christians individually and adopted so often that people think it's the Christian story, but it's not, it never was. The difference is plural. One, bodily resurrection. If this is the account of the afterlife you start with, there are important religious differences. Apart from philosophical differences, there are important religious differences between this and the Platonist story. The first major difference is that in the resurrection account of death and the afterlife, you do in fact die. You have to face extinction off the edge of the table, so to speak, where you exist and you cease to exist. If you think that you are a soul accidentally related to a body and that your soul is eternal, you never will die. And that was Plato's argument. You shouldn't fear death because death is an illusion. You never will die. But Christians didn't think that. And you may personally not think that either. In this account, you do actually have to disappear. And you may never get resurrected. If you do get resurrected, it's not because there's something about the nature of you that is eternal or something. So you still have to explain that in Plato. Just because you're not related to your body, why think you're eternal? He thought you were eternal because immaterial forms can't be extinguished. Physical things get extinguished. But who knows whether that's right? This death is real, and more life, the afterlife, is dependent on God, presumably. It's dependent on something beyond you to bring you back to life. If you do in fact die, then if we're going to have a story of the afterlife has to be recreated. It has to be brought into existence again, because we don't have in a resurrection story some soul that drifted off into space somewhere that was alive the whole time and is just waiting on body. In that sense, death is not a real thing. If that's what your afterlife is, it's going to be a massive change, but it wouldn't be death in any strong sense of the word. In the resurrection story, if you're going to have more life, there had better be a God to explain it. Weirdly, in the Platonist story, you don't need a God to have an afterlife because you are an eternal soul. If that's just what you are, God need not come into the story at all. You just will survive because that's part of your nature. Right? All right. The tricky part of resurrection, those seem to be things that speak in its favor. It makes more sense of psychology. It makes more sense of the relationship of your psychology to your body. It makes more sense of the religious dependence on God as your creator. It makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways, but is it possible? The last question. John Hick argues for its possibility in a thought experiment. And the thought experiment goes something like this. You have a person, John Smith, who disappears in the United States, and something exactly similar to this person reappears in India. Reappears is a loaded term. Appears in India. And we ask questions about this person. Do you remember going to school this day? Can I see your driver's license? What's your mother's name? What'd you eat for breakfast this morning? You look inside their stomach with an x-ray and they had that for breakfast, yada, yada, yada. Question is, would we say that this person is John Smith without any story about how the person got from here to here? His answer is, it may be a matter of decision, it may be a matter of just naming things in a particular way, but he thinks most of us would say this is the same person. Now, what are we saying when we say this is the same person? We need a little, what's being said is less important than what's not being said. And that's really the point of John Hick's article here. We have, I believe 2 or 3 times in this class, hit Aristotle's old metaphysical account of explanation. Aristotle's 4 causes. Let's hit it one at a time. These are 4 ways of explaining what a thing is. And so they're really relevant right now, right? We want to know what makes a thing what it is, what makes you you, and is this person, without asking any further questions, you at the end of this resurrection story. The quick version of this is Aristotle's ways of saying what a thing is. You can say what a thing is by saying what it's made of, what stuff it's made of, what substance it's formed from. Is it formed from matter or soul? Is it water or so on and so on and so on and so on? What is it made of? Is one way to say what a thing is. We can say what a thing is by talking about its form or its qualities. It's tall, it remembers being, born in Indiana. It can talk about where it came from. These are formal qualities. These are qualities of John Smith. They're not accounts of what he's made of. They're his shape, size, what he looks like, what he sounds like. We'll get to this story in a second. Let's get the other two out. The efficient cause of a thing is our version of the word cause. Its maker, its origin, what created in so many words. So one way to say what a thing is to say where it came from. You came from your parents. That's part of what makes you who you are. Right? This statue came from Michelangelo. That's part of what makes it what it is. The final cause of a thing is its purpose, or its telos, as in the teleological argument from way back at the beginning of this class. The final cause of a thing is to say what it's for, what it does. Of these, Karen Trindle, which of these four has been preserved in the jump from the United States to India? Which ones can we check so far?
We can definitely check the formal ones.
Yeah, I kind of circled that, right? That's right.
Well, that would be the easiest. That would be the easiest
one to check. You can see what it looks like. You can see what it's saying. You can hear what it sounds like. You can, weigh it. You can.
In the case of a missing person,
yeah.
I think those are the things you'd really look at.
Those are the things you would look for to tell whether you have the same person you started with. You wouldn't ask where it came from, because in this story you've got a disappearance and a reappearance. Is this supposed to be a metaphor for resurrection? Yeah, it's supposed to be a metaphor for this person died, we have a new person, do we think it's the same person? John Hick's account for this is intentionally minimalistic. It's intentionally narrowing the range of questions you focus on to one, essentially. And if it meets that criterion for Hick, we would say this is you. Now, I guess the way to make this vivid is to ask yourself whether you'd be willing to disappear knowing only that someone in India would pop into existence claiming to be you. Would you?
No. It sounds like a bad bet.
It sounds like a gamble, right? It sounds like, what else would you need to know?
I would need to know if I would still have my consciousness. Would I be aware that I was me? What would my life be like in India?
Right.
Would I see my friends and my family?
Well, this person over here would say, I'm Karen Trindle. I get to go see my friends now. I'm certainly conscious. The question would be how we know whether that's your consciousness.
Right.
You saying
And not an imposter.
Not an imposter. Because those consciousness is a quality too. It's a quality you and I both have right now. We're aware of things and so on. But what makes one of those yours?
Yeah, I'd really wouldn't be able to know until it was too late.
It might be a matter of what you're made of. There were 3 stories in Hick's little metaphor here. In the first story, you disappear and somebody appears in India. Story 2, this guy dies. And part 2 of the story is exactly the same. Now, Hick's little sleight of hand here is to say, if you said it the first time that this is John Smith or this is the same guy, then presumably you've got to say it even if you've got a dead body on your hands over here.
Right.
Right? Would you say that this is the same person if they reappear not in India, but in some place we'll call heaven?
Yes, that would be less of a risk because I'd be dead anyway, so I might as well hope I'll end up in heaven.
Yeah.
Or India.
Yeah.
Either way, maybe it's better off than being dead.
Right. So, what's not being said in this story? Anything about this one? It's not said in this story that the new you is going to be made of the same stuff. And that's intentional. It's intentional because, you know, in the New Testament, when Paul talks about what you will be in heaven, he says you'll be made of a different substance. You'll be made of a different material. You'll be made of what he calls soma pneumaticon. Breathly body. Soma is body in Greek. Pneuma, like pneumonia. Breath.
Is that from 1984?
Soma is in 1984. This is from. It's from.
Well, right. It's 1984 from this.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's just a Greek word for body, but also for sleep. It's insomnia.
And that's the drug they take,
That's
and
the drug they take to put themselves to sleep.
and then they're described as being nomadic.
That's right. That's right. And we might wonder if you're in heaven and made of the same bodily stuff, whether you would just decompose and die again. This idea is supposed to rule that out.
Right.
You die now because you're made of corruptible matter. And in heaven, you're supposed to have something that looks like you, that has all of your qualities, but is made of a new substance. Like transubstantiated. Right? You may ask yourself at this point whether something that looked exactly like you but was made of different stuff is you. But last little thing on John Hick, and we're going to call it a day. There's a skepticism about this from another Christian philosopher, not an atheist or anything. It's from Peter Van Inwagen, who gives the following parable. There's a manuscript that burns in an old monastery. The monastery has a manuscript that is from St. Augustine in the 5th century. And what is a manuscript? A manuscript is by definition handwriting, right? And it's not a manuscript if it's just a book that is copied from copies from something St. Augustine wrote. We only have a manuscript if Augustine wrote it. Now, the monastery burns to the ground and is rebuilt. And after it's rebuilt, a miracle takes place and they see the book again. And the monks say, oh, lo, it's a miracle. We have the manuscript. We still have the Augustinian manuscript. Is this possible? Peter Van Inwagen asks. Is it possible that they still have a manuscript? Well, they have a copy of the manuscript. What do they not have? What would you say? Would you say that they could, in principle, have not just a book with some writing that is carefully put together by St. Augustine, but an original manuscript? What does it take for something to be a manuscript?
Well,
It has to be written by St. Augustine, right? If it's going to be an Augustinian manuscript, it has to be written by his own hand, right? Now, so God performs a miracle and takes all the ashes of the original manuscript and puts them back together. Exactly in the same form as they were before. In fact, it's even made of the same stuff it was before. It's made of the same ashes. It's made of the same, decayed, burnt material, recomposed, and it is exactly similar in matter and form to the original manuscript. But it has a different origin. The first one was written by St. Augustine. The second one was, so to speak, put together by God, written by God. Now, what is the point of this little parable? Van Inwagen is not skeptical here that God could take a bunch of atoms and recompose them and make an exact copy of the manuscript. The question is whether this recomposed thing is the original or a copy. What do you think? Is it an original or is it a copy?
If it's made after he did it,
Yeah.
probably a copy.
Yeah. Augustine wrote a manuscript, as in it was from his hand. It
Right.
burned. It gets put back together.
But not by
God,
him.
But not by Augustine. So what we have is a thing of exactly the same matter, the same form, but not the same word. And if it does not have the same origin, it is not an original. The word original has origin in it, right? So
Right.
something is an original version of whatever it is by asking where it came from. We figure out whether we have an original or a copy by asking, where did this come from? Now, what is the relevance of this to questions about resurrection? Well, the question is, what is your origin? You were born to a mother and went through a life with a family, and you came from New Hope, Pennsylvania, and I came from Nashville, Tennessee. And we will die someday. And when we die, the story is supposed to be that our ashes will be recomposed, our matter will get put back together, we'll have the same form. We may or may not be made of the same material. Let's make it easy and say we're made of the same material. This is our question now. If the thing that is put back together did not go through your life, if it was made by God and not your mom, is it you? That's Van Inwagen's question. He thinks, because he's a Christian and he is contractually obligated to believe in the resurrection of the dead, that God will do this. But he is thoroughly puzzled, he says, about how that could happen because he thinks it looks like a contradiction. Some copy of you could be you. Right? That's the puzzle for resurrection, is how this recreated thing could be the thing I'm talking about.
It's like a clone.
To be a not a clone. Right? Maybe there's a solution to that. Maybe the